Bandar Abbas, gone dark in the middle of the night, precision munitions coming down on Iran's biggest naval hub on the Strait of Hormuz, and this is now the 5th night in a row this has happened. That's not a headline I'm exaggerating for you. That's literally what U.S. Central Command confirmed a few hours ago. Command centers, air defense sites, coastal surveillance, all specifically named as targets in the same statement. Okay, let's get into it. Hey everybody, Ryan here, and welcome back to Max Afterburner. If you're new to the channel, I'm a former F-15E combat fighter pilot. I flew the F-16 with the Air Force Thunderbirds, and I've spent years since then flying the Boeing 737 and the Airbus A220 as an airline pilot. So between all of that, I've got a pretty deep well of both fighter and airline experience to pull from when a story like this breaks. And this one is breaking fast. Before I get into the details, same rule I always follow on this channel. Everything I tell you today is coming from confirmed CENTCOM statements, on the record quotes, and verified reporting from outlets that have people on the ground. If I'm giving you my own read as a pilot, I'll say so. If something is still just a threat or a rumor, I'll say that too. Let's break down what actually happened, why Bandar Abbas matters so much strategically, and where this is realistically headed next. So here's the state of play as of right now. This war between the US, Israel, and Iran kicked back into a hot, active phase after a ceasefire that had been holding since April fractured on July 7th, when Iran struck multiple commercial vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz. Since that day, the United States has hit Iran on 5 consecutive nights. Wednesday alone saw 2 separate waves. CENTCOM launched the first wave around 6 a.m. Eastern Time, hitting Iran's coastal defense systems, along with cruise, missile storage, and launch sites specifically on Greater Tumb Island. That's one of the small islands right at the mouth of the strait that Iran uses to control access to the waterway. That first wave wrapped up by 7:30 a.m. Then, at 3 p.m. Eastern, CENTCOM announced a second wave, and this is the one I really want to walk you through, because this is the one that hit Bandar Abbas directly. Bandar Abbas is not some random town. It's Iran's most important port city on the Strait of Hormuz. It's home to a major Iranian naval base, and it sits right at the choke point for roughly 1/5 of the entire world's oil and gas supply. CENTCOM's own statement described this wave as striking, quote, Iranian command centers, air defense sites, missile and drone capabilities, and coastal surveillance facilities, and specifically named Bandar Abbas as one of the locations hit with precision munitions. When a strike package goes after command centers and coastal surveillance in the same city that controls maritime traffic through Hormuz, that's not a symbolic hit. That's the US trying to physically degrade Iran's ability to threaten shipping through the single most important waterway in global energy trade. That's the critical target in this story, and it's confirmed on the record, straight from CENTCOM. For context on why this particular city keeps coming up, Bandar Abbas has functioned for decades as the headquarters of Iran's regular navy, not just the IRGC's separate naval branch, and it sits almost directly across the water from some of the busiest tanker lanes on the planet. Researchers who study the region have described a small cluster of islands near there, Abu Musa, Greater Tumb, Lesser Tumb, along with Hengam, Keshem, Larak, and Hormuz itself, as forming what amounts to Iran's layered defense of the strait. And that's exactly why you're seeing Greater Tumb Island show up in strike reporting alongside Bandar Abbas this week. They are 2 pieces of the same defensive network. Take out the command and surveillance capability in Bandar Abbas and degrade the missile storage on the islands nearby. And you're chipping away at the entire system Iran built specifically to threaten shipping through that waterway, not just hitting isolated targets at random. Now let me back up and give you the full picture of how we got to this point, because I think the scale of this campaign gets lost if you're just tuning in for the first time. The current war formally kicked off on February 28th of this year, when the US and Israel launched what Trump called major combat operations against Iran, hitting military, government, and infrastructure targets. That triggered Iranian missile and drone attacks against Israel and against American bases across the region, and an early attempt by Iran to choke off the Strait of Hormuz entirely. Hezbollah joined in from Lebanon within days. A ceasefire held, starting April 7th, and in mid-June, both sides actually signed a memorandum of understanding that partially reopened the strait. For a few weeks, it looked like this thing might actually wind down. Then came July 6th and 7th. Iran struck commercial vessels in the strait, and Trump publicly declared the ceasefire over. Since then, we've watched this escalate night after night, and CENTCOM says the cumulative total since this war began is now more than 8,000 targets struck across Iran, including something like 130 vessels. Let's talk about what Trump has actually said on the record, because his public statements have been about as blunt as it gets. Speaking at the NATO summit in Turkey last week, he told reporters, quote, "We're going to hit them very hard tonight. We're going to hit them hard tomorrow night. We're going to hit them really hard the night after." That's a direct quote, not paraphrased for effect. And just this week, in an interview with Hugh Hewitt, he said that If Iran doesn't come back to the table and cooperate on peace talks, the U.S. would move next week to target what he called key Iranian infrastructure. And he specifically floated knocking out power plants and bridges. Separately, in a Fox Business interview this week, he also said Iran had reached out wanting to meet and make a deal, though defense analysts speaking to CNBC said they still don't see a clear path to any actual settlement, given how many times talks have already stalled out. I want to flag clearly, none of that infrastructure escalation has happened yet as of this recording. Power plants and bridges are not on the confirmed target list. They are a stated threat, and there's a real difference between the two. I'm not going to blur that line for you just because it makes for a more dramatic headline. On the naval side, Trump also reinstated a full blockade on Iranian ports this week and floated the idea of charging a 20% toll on cargo passing through the Strait of Hormuz before reportedly backing off that specific number in favor of trade arrangements with Gulf states instead. CENTCOM confirmed that during just the first 24 hours of the blockade being enforced, U.S. forces redirected 2 compliant commercial vessels and disabled 1 non-compliant one, a Curacao-flagged tanker called the Belma that was headed toward Karg Island. According to CENTCOM's own statement, a U.S. aircraft fired Hellfire missiles into the ship's smokestack after it ignored multiple warnings, disabling it without letting it continue onto Iran. That's the kind of enforcement action we're now seeing play out in real time on the water, not just in the air. Iran, for its part, has not been sitting quietly through any of this. In response to the blockade and the renewed strikes, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps said it struck U.S. military targets in Bahrain, Kuwait, and Jordan. Kuwait's defense ministry confirmed its forces intercepted 4 cruise missiles and 21 drones, and said the attack targeted a number of what it called vital facilities, resulting in material damage but no reported casualties. Jordan's military said it shot down several Iranian missiles in its own airspace. Iran also struck the U.S. Fifth Fleet's home base at Naval Support Activity Bahrain, though the U.S. military said it intercepted the attacks against civilian targets there. On the Iranian side, at least 7 Iranian military personnel were reportedly killed in one of the overnight strikes on a military base in the country's southeast, according to Iran's own army. And Iranian state media reported explosions across multiple cities, including Bandar Abbas, Avaz, and Chabahar, with one report saying a hospital in Avaz that treats children with cancer had to be temporarily evacuated after a projectile from a U.S. strike landed nearby. I want to include that detail because I think an honest breakdown of a story like this has to acknowledge the human cost on the ground, not just the hardware. And it's worth remembering that reporting like this is coming through Iranian state media, which means it hasn't been independently verified by outside journalists the way the CENTCOM statements have. So I'd treat casualty figures from either side with a degree of caution until they're corroborated. There was one piece of lower key news buried in all of this that I think is worth pulling out because it's a small sign that some level of communication is still happening between these two governments, even in the middle of an active bombing campaign. Trump announced this week that Iran released an American woman who had been detained since December of 2024, and he publicly thanked Iran for what he called a gesture of goodwill. That doesn't mean this conflict is anywhere close to over, but it does tell you the diplomatic channel between Washington and Tehran hasn't gone completely dark, even while the military channel is running hot. Now let's get into the hardware, because I know a lot of you are here specifically for the weapons breakdown, and I want to do this properly. The strikes we've confirmed this week, the ones hitting coastal defense systems, missile storage on Greater Tunb Island, and the command and surveillance infrastructure at Bandar Abbas, these are being carried out primarily with precision-guided munitions in the 2,000-pound class, built around penetrating warheads like the BLU-109, typically delivered as GBU-31 JDAMs. These are effective against hardened structures like command bunkers, missile storage facilities, and radar installations, but they're not in the same category as the true deep bunker busters that made headlines during earlier phases of this war. Let me quickly run through the escalation ladder here because it matters for understanding what comes next if this keeps intensifying. At the bottom, you've got that 2,000-pound class weapon I just mentioned. That's the workhorse being used on most of these nightly strikes right now. One step up is the GBU-72, a newer 5,000-pound class penetrator that CENTCOM confirmed using back in March against underground Iranian cruise missile storage near the Strait of Hormuz. That one can be carried by the F-15E, or the B-1, which gives the Air Force a lot more flexibility for repeated strikes than relying on stealth bombers alone. And at the very top of the ladder is the GBU-57, the massive ordnance penetrator, a 30,000-pound bunker buster that can only be carried by the B-2 Spirit. And that's the weapon that took out Iran's deeply buried Fordo enrichment site back in June of 2025 during Operation Midnight Hammer. As of right now, this week's strikes have stayed on the lower rungs of that ladder, hitting coastal and surface-level infrastructure rather than the deeply buried targets that would require the MOP. That's an important distinction because it tells you this current wave is aimed specifically at degrading Iran's ability to threaten the Strait of Hormuz, not at another round of strikes on the buried nuclear infrastructure. Let me explain quickly why that distinction actually matters mechanically, not just strategically. A radar site or command bunker on the coast is a surface or near-surface target. A couple thousand pounds of penetrating warhead is more than enough to take it out, and you can carry a lot more of those weapons per sortie, which lets you hit more targets faster across a wider area in a single night. A deeply buried facility like Fordow or Pickaxe Mountain is a completely different engineering problem. You need a weapon heavy enough and hardened enough to survive punching through dozens or even hundreds of feet of rock before it detonates. And there just aren't many aircraft in the world capable of carrying a weapon that large. So when you see a strike campaign staying on 2,000 and 5,000 pound class weapons night after night, that's a pretty strong signal all by itself about what kind of targets are actually being prioritized right now, regardless of what's being threatened publicly. It's also worth remembering this isn't the first time this exact escalation pattern has played out. Back in June of 2025, during what's since been called the 12-Day War, Israel struck Iranian military and nuclear sites first. Iran retaliated, and the U.S. eventually joined in directly with the Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan strikes using the MOP for the very first time in combat. That war ended in a ceasefire too, and it clearly didn't resolve anything long-term because here we are, just over a year later, in a conflict that, by some independent estimates, has already cost American taxpayers well over $100 billion. And that's before factoring in whatever this current 5-night stretch adds to the total. I bring that history up because I think it's the most useful lens for judging how this current round plays out. Strike, ceasefire, re-escalation has already repeated itself more than once in this conflict, and there's no guarantee this time is any different unless something actually changes at the negotiating table. Which brings me to the target everyone keeps asking me about in the comments, Pickaxe Mountain. If you watched my last video, you know the background here. It's a suspected Iranian nuclear facility built directly into a mountain near Natanz. Construction started back in 2020, and depending on the assessment you read, it could be buried under anywhere from 80 meters to as much as 2,000 feet of granite. It has never been struck, not during the 12-day war in 2025, and not in this current war either, even though Trump has publicly named it as a possible target, saying in an interview that the U.S. would probably give it, quote, a nice big fat shot right in the front door. I want to be very clear with you, as of this recording, Pickaxe Mountain is still an unstruck target. It has not been hit. What has changed this week is that Trump's rhetoric has broadened beyond just Pickaxe Mountain to include power plants and bridges as potential targets next week if Iran doesn't return to the negotiating table. Whether any of that actually happens is genuinely unknown right now, and I think it's important for a channel like mine to sit in that uncertainty honestly, rather than manufacture a target hit that hasn't been confirmed just to make a thumbnail more exciting. Let me give you my honest read as a pilot on why the campaign has stayed focused on Bandar Abbas, Greater Tumb Island, and the coastal infrastructure rather than escalating straight to power plants or Pickaxe Mountain. Militarily, this makes a lot of sense to me, and I don't think it's an accident. The stated objective from CENTCOM, over and over in every one of these statements, is degrading Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. That's a much narrower and more achievable military objective than trying to permanently destroy a deeply buried nuclear facility. You go after the coastal radar, the missile storage, the command centers, the fast attack boats, because those are the systems Iran is actually using right now to threaten tankers in real time. Hitting a hardened facility a mile and a half from Natanz doesn't do anything to stop a fast attack craft from launching a missile at a commercial vessel tomorrow morning. So from a pure operational standpoint, the target set we're actually seeing lines up logically with the stated goal of reopening safe passage through the strait, and the more dramatic targets like power plants and Pickaxe Mountain look to me more like escalation options being held in reserve and publicly signaled to try to pressure Iran back into negotiations without actually having to pull the trigger on them yet. I also want to spend a minute on something I don't think gets enough attention in the coverage of this war, which is the economic side of what's happening in the strait, because it actually explains a lot of the military decision-making behind these strikes. Before this war, roughly a fifth of the entire world's oil and gas supply moved through that waterway. When Iran threatens or blocks it, the effects show up almost immediately in global energy markets. Brent crude has been swinging hard through all of this. It spiked over 9.5% in a single day earlier this week after Trump announced the renewed blockade, trading above $85 a barrel, still well below the nearly $120 a barrel it hit at the height of the conflict earlier this year, but clearly climbing again. WTI, the US benchmark, moved almost identically, up around 9% on the same day to settle above $78 a barrel, its biggest single-day jump since early April. And it's not just an abstract market number either. Back when the Strait was effectively closed earlier in this war, gas prices in the US actually crossed $4 a gallon for the first time since 2022. And the International Monetary Fund put out a formal warning that the broader conflict was driving higher prices and slower growth on a global scale, not just regionally. That's the backdrop that makes every single strike on Bandar Abbas or Greater Tumb Island matter well beyond the borders of Iran, because the entire world's energy markets are watching this waterway in particular. And it's not just Iran playing hardball here either. The IRGC threatened this week to halt all energy exports from the entire region in retaliation for the US blockade, saying, in their words, the export of oil and gas from the region will be either for everyone or for no one. That's a pretty stark statement, and it tells you Iran sees control over that strait as one of its few remaining sources of real leverage in this fight. On top of that threat, Iran has continued targeting Gulf states directly, and it's worth being specific about what's actually been confirmed there rather than lumping it all together. Kuwait's Ministry of Defense said its forces intercepted 4 cruise missiles and 21 drones in a single wave, and described the attack as targeting a number of vital facilities, resulting in material damage, but thankfully no reported casualties. Jordan's armed forces separately confirmed shooting down several Iranian missiles in their own airspace. And Bahrain, which hosts the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet headquarters, has had its air raid sirens sound multiple times in the past week alone, with residents reporting being woken up by loud explosions overnight. Qatar's foreign ministry, notably, has tried to stay above the fray as a mediator, posting a statement stressing what it called the need to spare the region, the consequences of these unjustified attacks, and to advance the path of dialogue, diplomacy, and de-escalation. Along with Pakistan, Qatar has been serving as one of the lead go-betweens in whatever indirect talks have happened between Washington and Tehran this year, which tells you that even amid all of this active fighting, there are still functioning diplomatic channels working quietly in the background. There's also a legal and political dimension unfolding back home that I think is worth mentioning briefly, because it's shaping how much longer this can realistically continue. Under the War Powers Resolution, the President is required to notify Congress within 48 hours of the start of military hostilities. And both the House and Senate actually passed a War Powers Resolution last month, specifically trying to limit Trump's ability to keep carrying out strikes against Iran without further congressional authorization. The administration's position has been that the original hostilities began back in February and technically ended when the April ceasefire was signed, meaning the new round of strikes since July 7th falls into a legal gray area that Democrats have said they're exploring options to challenge. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not going to pretend to have a strong opinion on how that plays out, but I think it's a piece of the story worth knowing about, because it's a real constraint on how open-ended this campaign can become. Trump himself has downplayed the idea that this represents a new, prolonged phase of the war, at one point calling the renewed campaign a, quote, military skirmish, even while acknowledging in the same breath that Iran is, in his words, going to fight for a while, and that the fighting has already well outlasted the 4 to 6 week timeline his own administration originally floated when this started back in February. Let's get back to the aircraft and crews actually flying these missions, because I think that part of the story deserves more attention than it usually gets. A 5-hour strike mission, like the one CENTCOM described for the coastal strikes, involves an enormous amount of coordination, strike aircraft, tanker support for aerial refueling, electronic warfare aircraft to jam Iranian radar and communications, and often overwatch from drones like the MQ-9 Reaper to confirm target damage in real time. Every single one of those strikes you're seeing described in a CENTCOM press release represents hours of mission planning behind it, intelligence updates on where Iranian coastal defense systems have moved or been repaired since the last strike, weaponeering calculations on exactly what ordnance is needed to defeat a specific bunker or radar site, and a full package of supporting aircraft to get the strike aircraft in and out safely. None of that complexity shows up in a 15-second clip of an explosion online. But it's the actual backbone of how a campaign like this gets sustained night after night for 5 nights running without losing an aircraft. I'll speak from my own background here for a second, because I think it helps explain why this pace is genuinely demanding on the people flying it. When I was flying combat missions in the F-15E, a single sortie could easily run several hours once you factor in the transit to the target area, time on station, and the flight back. And that's without even talking about weather diverts or a target that moves at the last minute and forces the whole plan to shift. Now imagine doing that on a 5-hour strike package at night, over defended airspace, with multiple aircraft types all having to hit their timing windows within seconds of each other, so the strike package isn't exposed any longer than absolutely necessary. Every crew involved, from the strike pilots themselves to the tanker crews keeping everyone fueled to the electronic warfare operators jamming enemy radar in real time, is running on an enormous amount of built-in redundancy and rehearsal. because there's essentially zero room for a mistake when you're that deep into contested airspace. I have a lot of respect for everyone executing that mission profile night after night right now, regardless of how any of us feel about the broader politics driving the war itself. I also want to walk through, briefly, how a target like the command center or coastal surveillance site at Bandar Abbas actually gets selected and cleared for a strike in the first place, because I think it demystifies the process a bit. It starts well before the bombs ever leave an aircraft, with weeks or months of satellite imagery and signals intelligence tracking exactly where Iran's radar, command and missile storage infrastructure sits, and how it's been repaired or relocated after previous strikes. That intelligence gets fused together and handed to targeteers, who build what's essentially a defeat mechanism for each specific target, how many weapons, what type, and from what angle, to actually achieve the intended effect without unnecessary risk to civilians nearby. Legal and intelligence reviewers sign off at multiple stages of that process too, checking the target against the laws of armed conflict and confirming the intelligence picture is current before it ever becomes an authorized aim point. Only after that whole process is complete does it become an actual line item in a strike package like the one that hit Bandar Abbas this week. That's part of why, even in a fast-moving war like this one, you don't see completely random targets getting hit. The campaign has stayed remarkably consistent on coastal defense, command and control, and maritime threat infrastructure since July 7th, because that reflects the actual target list that's been built and refined over the course of this specific phase of the conflict. I want to address something directly, because I've seen it in the comments a lot on this channel recently. People saying videos like this feel like they're AI generated, or accusing channels covering this war of just reading off a script without any real understanding behind it. I get why that skepticism exists right now. There's a lot of low-effort content flooding this space, channels slapping a dramatic thumbnail on top of a wall of unverified rumors and calling it news. What I can tell you is that everything I've walked you through today traces back to an actual CENTCOM statement, an on-the-record quote, or verified reporting from an outlet with people covering this on the ground, and anywhere I gave you my own analysis instead of a confirmed fact. I told you clearly that's what it was. That's the standard I hold every video on this channel to, and it's the same standard I've held since I started breaking down aviation stories here on Max Afterburner, whether that's an airliner crash investigation, a dogfight clip, or a war zone rescue operation. I'd rather lose a little bit of dramatic flair than tell you something happened that I can't actually back up with a source, because the moment I do that even once, I've lost the thing that actually makes this channel worth watching in the first place, which is that you can trust what I'm telling you. So where does this realistically go from here? Based on everything that's confirmed right now, I expect the nightly strike pattern to continue focused on the Strait of Hormuz target set, coastal radar, missile and drone storage, naval infrastructure, command centers in port cities like Bandar Abbas, because that's the stated mission and it's the target set the U.S. has the clearest operational justification for hitting repeatedly. The bigger question mark is whether Trump follows through on the threat to expand into power plants and bridges next week, and whether Pickaxe Mountain ever actually gets struck. I don't think anyone outside a very small circle in Washington actually knows the answer to that right now, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise just to give you a clean ending. What I can tell you is I'll be tracking this closely, and the moment there's a confirmed strike on either of those targets, or a confirmed break toward real negotiations, I'll have a full breakdown up here on Max Afterburner as fast as I can get accurate information together. I'll also say this, watching this play out night after night, the pattern I keep coming back to is that both sides seem to be fighting for leverage at the negotiating table as much as they're fighting for territory or targets on the ground. Every strike on Bandar Abbas, every Iranian missile intercepted over Bahrain or Kuwait, every barrel of oil that swings in price, all of it is happening in the shadow of talks that keep almost restarting and then falling apart again. That's honestly the piece of this story I think is most underappreciated right now. This isn't just a bombing campaign, it's also a very public, very expensive negotiation being conducted partly through airstrikes. And understanding it that way, I think it actually explains the target selection better than almost anything else. Before I wrap up, I want to ask you two things, and I mean both of these. They're not just filler at the end of the video. First, if this kind of grounded, source-checked breakdown of what's actually happening is valuable to you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications right now. Because this story is moving fast. We've had 5 straight nights of strikes and no sign of it slowing down, and I don't want you missing the next update the moment something new gets confirmed. Second, drop a comment and tell me specifically what you want the next video to cover, whether that's a deeper technical breakdown of the weapons involved, more on the economic side of the Strait of Hormuz standoff, or a closer look at what a strike on Pickaxe Mountain would actually require if it does happen. I read every single comment on this channel and it genuinely shapes what I dig into next. Thank you so much for watching. Stay safe out there, and as always, this is Ryan here on the Max Afterburner channel, signing off.